Okay, thank you very much again, Dr. Tariq, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure here to be part of your evenings or your afternoons again. So what I'll do is I shall share my screen. And what I'll do is I'll actually switch my video off because I think the connection may be slightly better. So I've switched that off. There you go. And I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Okay, hope you can all see that. So great. So what we're going to talk about for this next hour or so, I'm going to introduce you to some new terminology in GCP, and I'm going to focus on something we call source documents and essential documents. So the objectives I have for this session, well, first of all, I'll tell you, what is the purpose of source documentation? We will look at what source data and source documents are, and I shall define these for you. And then we look at the essential documents that are required for the conduct of a clinical trial and why we need them. And then finally, I'm going to introduce a term to you called source document verification, or SDV. This is something the sponsor will do for a clinical trial, but it does impact yourselves as researchers. So before we go any further, I shall do a little bit of a recap from yesterday and day before yesterday. If we go back to day one and going back to the principles of good clinical practice, principle number 2.10 stated that all clinical trial information should be recorded, handled, and stored in a way that allows its accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. And this is what we shall be focusing on today, is this specific principle. Now, this principle I'm going to talk about applies to all records that are referenced in the guidelines. So for example, this includes electronic records as well as paper records. Now, section 4 of the GCP guidelines, section 4.9, talks about records and reports. So section 2.10 telling you we must have good documentation, and section 4.9, which is under investigator obligations, talks about how we will achieve this principle. And then finally, section 8 of the GCP guidelines talks about the essential documents for the conduct of a clinical trial. And I shall be explaining what the requirements are for GCP if you are going to conduct a clinical trial, how and what type of documents you will be maintaining and what you shall be actually documenting. So going back a little bit more and saying, recapping on what is the purpose of good clinical practice. If you remember, I told you GCP has two broad pillars. The first pillar is protecting the rights, safety, and well-being of trial subjects. We looked at the rights yesterday when we talked about informed consent. The safety of the subjects we should look at tomorrow when I talk about safety in clinical trials. The second pillar is that the data resulting from the trial are complete, accurate, and unbiased, and this is the pillar we are now going to focus on when we talk about source documentation and essential documents. So I keep on saying source data, source documents. What are they and what do they mean? Here is the definition of source data according to ICH GCP. So source data are all information in original records of clinical findings, observations, or other activities in a clinical study necessary for the reconstruction and evaluation of the study. So source data important are the original records. So whatever the original records, the original clinical findings are, that is source data. Now this is a definition from section 1.51 of GCP. So I want you to remember source data, original records of findings. Then what are source documents? Here are source documents. So source documents are original documents and data and records. So basically what this means is source data are contained in source documents. So for example, hospital records are source documents, clinical office charts, lab reports, subject diaries, x-rays, scans, pharmacy dispensing records. All of these are called source documents. Wherever we capture source data, that becomes a source document. So for example, let's say, we are doing we're doing a clinical research, we're doing a clinical study, and the patient comes in, we take the patient's blood pressure. Unfortunately, the medical records are not with us, so we write that blood pressure on a post-it note. That post-it note then becomes a source document. And strictly speaking, it should not be destroyed. Usually what happens in practice sometimes is, study nurses, doctors will write something on a post-it note and then transcribe that data into the medical records. What still is going to be the source document is the original place where the first data was actually documented. So more examples of source documents. Again, these are examples, not an exhaustive list. Medical records, subject diaries, laboratory results, any records kept at pharmacy, labs, etc. Recorded data from automated instruments. So ECG charts, they are source documents. Source documents, as I mentioned, are essential, are very important to us because they will allow us, and I'll explain in a little while, to prove to us that this was accurate data. So the question now is, we have source documents, so medical records, everything, these are source documents. What is the purpose of these documents? First of all, they actually tell us that there is a subject, that the subject exists. So having medical records, we know that there is a subject. Very importantly, everything that happens in a clinical trial, in clinical research, if you remember, I said earlier on, we must document this. Everything is being documented in our medical records, in our investigative files, which I'm going to explain in a short while. And the purpose of all of this is allow for us the reported study conclusions can be reconstructed based on source documentation. So our source documentation is like a storybook. It contains exactly what happened in the clinical study. And also, source documents can help us explain if there were any protocol deviations, why they occurred. If we deviate from any protocol procedure, that has to be documented as well. Everything we do in clinical research and a clinical study must be documented. So, I said documented. What do we mean by documentation? Okay. ICH states the investigator or the institution should maintain adequate and accurate source documents and trial records that include all pertinent observation on each of the site's trial subjects. So every observation that is done according to the protocol has to be documented in the subject's source documents, and it has to be accurate. Now, when we are documenting information in our source documents, GCP tells you how this should be done. First of all, it should be attributable. What does that mean? It means it should be clear who has documented the data. So for example, a patient comes in, a measurement is taken, an assessment is made, that is documented in the medical records. This documentation should then be initialed or signed by who did this. So that is called attributability. So all data should be attributable. It should be legible. That means it should be readable and signatures identified. What we need, as we all know, all of our doctors' writings is kind of pretty messy, but in clinical research, we have to have nice, neat writing which can be read. It should be contemporaneous. And what do we mean by contemporaneous? This means it should be entered in a time frame of events. So for example, if a subject comes in today, I take a blood pressure assessment or whatever assessment it is, I should document it in a time frame of events. In other words, I should document it straight away. I shouldn't say to myself, you know what, the medical record's not here, I'll do it later, maybe 2, 3, 4 hours. The reason being is I may forget, I might make an error, I might make a mistake. Then that is not accurate data, which then impacts the second pillar of GCP, complete, accurate data. It should be original. And I mentioned that wherever the first record is made, that is going to be the source document. So attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. Accurate, consistent, and real representation of facts. So we do not want to see any errors. For example, the patient's blood pressure was 350 over 75. Well, that's wrong. That's a mistake somewhere. It has to be very, very accurate. And finally, it must be complete. Adequate, complete. All your source documents must be complete. The source documents, when we look at them, should be able to tell us exactly what was happening to the patient when they entered the clinical trial. So this attributability, legibility, contemporaneous, original, accurate, complete is known as an acronym of ALCOAC, A-L-C-O-A-C. You may have heard of ALCOA, A-L-C-O-A. Now another C has been added to it, ALCOAC. So this is part of good documentation practice. And as researchers, I want you to think when you are documenting things, make sure you are following these ALCOAC principles. So GCP goes on further. It says the investigator should ensure the accuracy, completeness, legibility, and timeliness of the data reported to the sponsor in the CRF and in all required reports. The CRF is the case report form, CRF. This is that data capture tool, the tool where you are transcribing information from the medical records, which is specific to the study, will go in this data capture tool. Now, case report forms or CRFs can either be paper-based or they can be electronic. So if you're doing a big clinical trial, obviously one of the purposes of the trial is to capture data to give us the evidence that will provide us when we do our analysis that this drug either was safe or it works. So that data must be entered into the case report forms in a timely manner. Something else it says, goes on to say further, is that the data that is reported on the CRF that is derived from the source documents should be consistent. And if there are any discrepancies, they should be explained. So what happens in a clinical study is you are provided with a protocol, you are provided with the investigator's brochure, you are provided with a consent form, and you are provided with the data capture tool, the CRF. And if it's electronic, it's called the eCRF. As you're seeing patients, you're documenting their history, you're documenting their the assessments, the procedures, everything in the medical records. You then have to transcribe this information into the case report form, the data capture tool. So this data capture, this data in the CRF should be consistent with the source data. So if the source data said that the patient's heart rate is 72 beats per minute, then in the CRF, it should clearly state it's 72 beats per minute. This is, we're looking at accuracy, and I'm going to explain towards the end of the lecture what the sponsor does to ensure that this is accurate and there are not any mistakes happening. Now, very, very important, ICH also goes to tell us if you're going to make any changes to any data, you should follow a specific format. So what it says here as an example is any change or correction to a case report form should be dated, initialed, and explained if necessary, and should not obscure the original entry. That is, we should be able to see an audit trail. If you make an error somewhere, don't use whiteout, don't use an eraser, put a line through it, put the correct value, sign it, and date it. If you need to put an explanation, explain it. The same would apply to your source documents. If you need to make a change in there, just put a line through the data point, initial it, date it, and if necessary, put a little explanation why you made this change. So having said that, we've talked about source documents. I've said medical records at the institution, they are the source documents. What should be inside these source documents? What should they contain that will make sure we are meeting good clinical practice? Now, as a minimum, in every source document, so for every subject who enters a clinical trial, there should be a statement there that's saying it's the evidence of study participation. So a statement which actually states that this subject has entered a clinical trial number, blah, 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 or whatever it is. So we would like to see that. We should be able to look at the medical history should be there, including the relevant history for the disease being treated. We should be able to verify the subject eligibility. So for example, if the protocol says the patients must meet this inclusion criteria, the source documents or the medical records should be able to support us with the documentation which clearly says that yes, they do meet this criteria. The subject's current physical condition should be there. So this is routine medical practice of medical documentation. The current illnesses, the current injuries should be there. The current medications they are taking, all of this should be clearly there. And as well as a description of the informed consent process. Now, if you remember yesterday, I actually mentioned that we must be documenting informed consent in the medical records. Just having a consent form isn't sufficient. There needs to be some kind of a statement. And what I'll do is I'll give you a guidance as to what type of information you should include when you're going to make that documentation that this patient or this subject entered a clinical trial. So what else should source documents contain? They should contain the dates of the actual subject visits and the visit number or name as per the protocol. So for example, if the protocol said visit 3, then in the medical records, you write visit 3 happened on this date, and these were the assessments, whatever they are, were taken. All medical study procedures should be completed and should be taken, including the dates, the results, and any investigator's assessment, if the protocol is asking for that. So basically, everything the protocol is saying you do, you will actually complete them. If the data lab samples, for example, were not taken, they were missed, we'd want to know why. So you document that as well. What we're doing is clearly generating evidence that the protocol was being followed, because this is good clinical practice. All SAEs and AEs, SAE stands for serious adverse event, and AE stands for adverse event. All of these are safety parameters that I shall be discussing tomorrow. All of these must be clearly documented in your source documents. And any illnesses, whatever the subjects have, this is safety information. We need that documented. If you have deviated from the protocol for any reason, that must be documented and why that happened. And also, very importantly, is the attributability, the signature or initials of the individuals who conduct any procedures, who assess the results. That should be actually documented as well. And finally, any additional information required by the protocol should also be documented in these source documents. So as a minimum, as you can see, it's not that much different from how you would routinely document things in medical records or your source documents, but there are a few additional requirements, such as statements of participation in a clinical trial, and such as a statement of informed consent. And this is now what I'll show you, how consent should be documented. Now, this is not specifically mentioned within GCP, but this is good practice that is accepted around the world on how consent should be documented. So as a minimum, consent, the protocol number. Subject is entering protocol number 007. Consent was taken in Arabic, the language of consent. The name of the person who's obtaining consent, me, Dr. Noordin, was taking consent. The date consent was taken on the 4th of May, I discussed the consent with blah, blah, blah. Okay. Also a statement that the subject was given the opportunity to ask questions and the answers were provided. The subject asked me questions and I provided the answers. If you really want, you can put down the subject asked these questions and these were my responses. This is your evidence of assessment of subject comprehension. If, for example, the subject is illiterate, we need to put down the impartial witness and, very importantly, the relationship of the impartial witness to the site. Because if you remember from yesterday, the impartial witness should be independent to the site and the institution. If there's a legally acceptable representative, we need to know who this was and their relationship to the subject. So if it's a pediatric clinical trial, the mother gave consent and that should be documented. And also state the consent form when signed and personally dated by the subject and the person obtaining consent, and a copy of the consent form was given to the subject. So if you document this as a document confirmation of consent, this would be very, very suitable and clear. So that is a little overview of source documents and source documentation. And we'll now focus a little bit on essential documents. But before I do that, just a little recap of source document, source data. Very importantly, they must be complete. We must be able to tell a story as to what is happening to the subjects as they enter the clinical trial and they're being managed during the clinical trial. All your medical records, your source documents will give us that information. So now let's move on to essential documents and what are essential documents. And this is where section 8 tells us what essential documents are. And this is the definition. So essential documents are documents which individually and collectively permit evaluation of the conduct of the study and the quality of the data produced. So these are documents. So part of essential documents are source documents. So source documents are essential documents. But there are also many, many other essential documents that make part of a clinical trial, and I'm going to explain those to you now. So essential documents, what do they do? Well, they permit evaluation of the trial conduct and their data quality. Very importantly, going back to the definition of GCP, GCP is an ethical, scientific quality standard. So we want quality. Okay? Essential documents would actually demonstrate the compliance of the investigator, the sponsor, and someone we call the monitor, who I'll explain in a short while, with GCP and applicable regulatory requirements. So just as you, as yourselves, as researchers or investigators have essential documents, the sponsor, so pharmaceutical company, biotechnology company, they have essential documents as well. And we all will maintain our essential documents in files, and I'll tell you what those files are. These essential documents really help us in the successful management of the trial, and they confirm that the validity of the trial, conduct of the trial, integrity of the data, and very importantly, if there's an inspection by a regulatory authority, they will want to look at all the essential documents. And from there, they should be able to construct how the study was conducted. So, I mentioned to you, investigator has some essential documents and sponsor has essential documents. When we do a clinical study, we will keep all of these documents in a file. As an investigator, we call it the investigator file. And as a sponsor, we call it a sponsor file. So before you start your clinical study, a file will be set up and will be established at the beginning of the trial. Okay. This file and lots of information will go in this file, and I'll tell you what this is, will stay at the investigator site. So what you will have is at your site when you're doing clinical research, you will have all your medical records for the patient, etc. And you will also have a separate file called an investigator file. And in this file, we need to maintain certain documents. So the investigator file will stay at the investigator site, and the sponsor file will stay at the sponsor site. Now, what Section 8 does, it clearly tells you what are the minimum list of documents that must be contained in each of these files. And what it does, so Section 8, that is going to tell you the minimum list. And how Section 8 has organized this, it's broken this into 3 sections, Section 8.2, Section 8.3, and Section 8.4. So what it does, it lists the documents that should be collected before the study starts. That comes under Section 8.2. It then lists the documents during the study. So when the clinical study is up and running, what documents are required to be maintained? And then finally, after the study has been completed, what documents remain after the study has been completed? So this is what these 3 sections, these 3 subsections will tell us in GCP in Section 8. Now here is a quick snapshot of what Section 8.2 looks like. So when you get to look at those ICH GCP guidelines, which you can download from ich.org, you go to Section 8, and this is what it does. There's a big table in there, and this is just to give you an example of a screenshot. And I'll explain this to you now. So what GCP does, it lists a whole list of documents that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, and what their purpose is, and then where will these be located? Who is going to keep these documents? So for example, before the study starts, you need an investigator's brochure. Well, you will have a copy in your files, and the sponsor has a copy. Then you have the signed protocol and amendments. Very importantly, you have a copy, and the investigator has, and the sponsor has a copy. So what you will see is there'll be lots of list of documents, and these are all essential documents. Now, some of these documents only you will keep, but not the sponsor. And some documents only the sponsor will keep and not you. And what you have to do is look at these. So what happens is when the clinical study starts, the sponsor will give you a file. And this file will have tabs inside them. And these will be divided saying communication, ethics committee tab, protocol tab, investigator tab, investigational product tab. And as the study is progressing, you just keep on filing the relevant documents in each of these files. And this is an essential document. So to give you an example of the essential documents, well, your source documents are essential documents. Obviously, the type of medical records do not go inside the investigator file. They're at the institution, which is fine. So they are actually essential documents. The IRB approval letter, that is an essential document. Any communication you have with the IRB, you must document that and place it in the investigator file. The signed protocol will go in the file. The signed informed consent forms, very important. These are very confidential documents. They will not be held in the sponsor file because this has the subject's name or initials on them, or signature, and we keep that confidential. You will keep them. Any financial aspects of the trial, this is an essential document. You will keep this in the investigator file. Your contractual agreement with the sponsor, that will go in the investigator file. The CV of the investigator, sub-investigator, and even the study team, that has to be the investigator file. The case report forms, these are also part of essential documents. Then we have the subject screening, enrollment, subject ID code list. These are special forms, which I'll explain to you when we do our module called investigator obligations. These are very important forms. They will only stay with you in your files. And there are many, many, many other forms which ICH talks about, GCP talks about, which are essential documents. So all of these forms, as the study is progressing, you are collecting. So in the beginning of the trial, you will have some documents. Now, as the trial progresses, you will start adding these documents. For example, if there's a protocol amendment, yeah, then that amended protocol will be part of your file. And obviously, before that protocol amendment is been implemented, you need IRB approval. So that IRB approval document, that letter, has to be part of the file. All safety information that's happening as the subjects are progressing in there, that is filed. Any communication you have with the sponsor of the trial, you are going to file that as well. So all of these are essential documents, which are like a nice big storybook, which tell us how the study is progressing. So very importantly, and this is important, as an investigator, you control all of the essential documents and records generated by yourself during, before, during, and after the trial. So it's your responsibility, obligation, and you will keep them. The documents that you keep, that file belongs to you. It doesn't go to the sponsor. Yes, it's an essential document, but it'll never leave the site, the investigative site. Okay. However, yes, you control them. However, you must make them available for an audit by the sponsor, or if there's a regulatory inspection. So if the sponsor says we're coming to audit you, they will want to look at all the essential documents. You have to make them available. If your regulatory authority says we need to see them, you will see them. Something else the sponsor does, which is called monitoring, and I'll say more about that later. You will make it available whenever the monitor comes to your site to review the data. So we have lots of documents, a lot of documents here, these essential documents. What happens when the study finishes? Do we destroy them? What do we do with them? Or if we keep them, how long do we keep them for? Well, ICH tells us the retention of essential documents. And this is what it says. It says all essential documents must be retained for at least 2 years after the last approval of a marketing application with no pending applications in an ICH region, or at least 2 years after discontinuation of clinical development of the investigational product. So what does this actually mean, at least 2 years after the last approval of the marketing application in an ICH region? Well, this is a decision the sponsor actually makes when they'll do the last marketing approval application. But to give you an example of a timeline, usually, and this is not written in stone anywhere, it's approximately 15 years. If not that, it should be longer if our regulatory requirements say it's needed, you should keep them for longer, or in agreement with the sponsor. But what's very important is the responsibility of the sponsor to inform you when these documents are no longer needed to be retained. So what happens is when we are doing our research and we finish our clinical study, we have all these documents. We have the investigative file. We have all these documents. They need to be maintained. Where do we keep them? Well, they need to be archived. So we see, is there a hospital archive? Where, or do they need to be archived off-site? That's very, very important. And also all subjects who enter the clinical research, their subject medical records cannot be destroyed for the same time period. So you have to ensure in a way that, if the subjects were in the trial, there's somewhere that, let's say, for example, they pass away or they die, their medical records cannot be destroyed. So what usually happens is sometimes a sticker is placed on the medical records which says subject is in a clinical trial, do not destroy the medical records. So this needs to be archived towards the end of the study. And before you do the clinical trial, what happens is sponsor comes and approaches you and they discuss the logistics of the trial with you. And they will discuss archiving with you, that after the study is completed, where will all this information go? So that's a little bit of an introduction to you and help you understand what we mean by source documents, what we mean by essential documents. What's critical here is the accuracy, the completeness of the data. Because what we're doing is we're using the data to make a decision, to give the evidence. It's evidence-based medicine that looked at this drug worked, it was good, or it was effective, or whatever. And we need to ensure it's accurate data because that's the second pillar of GCP. So what I'm going to do now is very briefly explain to you what the sponsor does, how they help us ensure that the data we're collecting, the data we're capturing, the data we're transcribing into the case report form is actually complete, accurate, and unbiased. And this process they do, or this whole sponsor oversight, they call this monitoring. So what happens is the monitor, so for every clinical study you will do from a pharmaceutical company, the sponsor obligation is they have to monitor the study. So they will allocate a scientist from the sponsor side who will come at interim periods and monitor you. And when I say monitor, what they will do is they'll come, spend some time, and they will go through the essential documents. They will look at the protocol, they will look at the essential documents, they will look at GCP, they will look at local regulations, and they will ensure that you are following them. And part of this type of monitoring, one of the aspects of monitoring, something specifically they do, is called CRF, or Case Report Form Review and Source Documentation, or SDV. And I'm going to explain that now. So I said they do monitoring. What do we mean by monitoring? So monitoring, by definition, is the act of overseeing the progress of a clinical trial and ensuring that it is conducted, recorded, and reported in accordance with the protocol, in accordance with standard operating procedures, in accordance with GCP and applicable regulatory requirements. So this individual who's the monitor will come and monitor, and this is what they're doing. They're making sure the protocol is followed and GCP is followed and local regulatory requirements are being followed. So what is the purpose of this? The purpose of monitoring is simple. By doing this, we're ensuring that the rights, well-being of subjects are being protected, that the trial data is complete, it's accurate, and verifiable from source documents. This is GCP, the standard definition of GCP. So basically, what the purpose of monitoring is to ensure that the trial is being conducted in accordance with good clinical practice, everything which ICH E6R2 is telling us to do, as well as with applicable regulatory requirements. So, CRF review I mentioned, what is this? So as you're capturing data in the case report form, there's lots of information you have to capture. So what the monitor will do, they will look at this and do an overall review of the CRF for consistency. Is it complete? Is it logical? Is it legible? They'll look for LCOAC. Are you following LCOAC? And then what they do is something called source document verification, or SDV. This is when they're going to check that the data which is in the CRF, or it could be an electronic CRF, is actually accurate, is actually what the medical records are saying, what your source documents are saying. So they are verifying the CRF data against the medical records, against the source documents. So when they do the CRF review, they're looking at consistency, completeness, logic check. They're making sure you're following the protocol. They're checking all safety parameters, pregnancies, everything is being documented. If there are any missed visits by the subjects, this is being documented, this is being explained, etc. So there's a lot they're doing, just making sure we are continuing following the protocol. On the other hand, source document verification, here's a little flow chart to tell you what happens. We have source data. So our source data could be, laboratory data, could be blood pressure data, measurements, ECGs, anything. All of these are captured and stored in source documents. So they are in source documents. So as site staff, you are entering the source, so the data in the source documents, you're entering there. You are then entering the source data from the source documents into the electronic CRF or the CRF. So that is your transcribing the data from the source to electronic CRF. So what the monitor does, when you look at the green arrow up there, they just come and they check the CRF against your source data. Is this okay? And if they're all okay, then we're happy with this. If they're not okay, then the monitor will raise something we call a query. So they will make sure that we have cleaned the data, that the data is cleaned. Once all of this data is cleaned from every site in the study, then this data, it will eventually end up in the clinical study report. So this process of checking the data from in between the CRF and the source documents, we call source document verification. And this is something the sponsor is doing as part of monitoring. But why do we do this? Why do we do source data verification? Importantly, to make sure that the subject exists, to make sure informed consent was obtained prior to study-related procedures. So this is something which the monitors will look at. When was consent taken? They'll look at the consent form, the date on the consent form. And then we'll look at when was the first study-related procedure conducted. We cannot conduct any study-related procedures without informed consent. They will check the inclusion-exclusion criteria. If the inclusion-exclusion criteria stated the subject has to be within 50 to 80 kilograms, they will check the weight of the patient in the medical records. Was it between that? They will check, are you following the protocol assessments, the protocol procedures? They'll look at all this data, make sure it's complete and it is accurate. They look for the completeness of this data. Obviously, this then impacts the integrity of the data. They will go to pharmacy, for example, if the drug is being maintained and stored in pharmacy, and they will look at this and say, is the right dose being given to the drug? How is the drug dispensing being done? How is the drug being stored? Is it being done in accordance with the protocol? And as an investigator, researcher, it's your obligation to ensure that everything is being done as per the protocol. Even if, for example, pharmacy is looking after the studied drug, you are ultimately responsible for the overall management and dispensing of the study drug. They look at safety, which is very, very important. And I won't say much about safety today, but I'll say more about it tomorrow. They will look at all safety reporting as well. And then finally, they'll make sure any CRF entries are accurate and consistent with source documents. So there you go. So that's a little bit of a overview of source data, source documents, and essential documents. Very, very important, because bottom line, we are collecting all this information because this is the data we need. This is the data we need that will give us the answers to the questions we are asking in our research. Data has to be the one. Okay, so just to finish off, to summarize this, I hope you now understand the purpose of source documentation. You understand what source data and source documents are. Hope I've given insight into the essential documents that are required for the conduct of the clinical trial, and also told you the purpose of source document verification, because this is something which the sponsor, although the sponsor does, it impacts you, and you should be aware of how this is done and what they're doing. And on that note, I'd open up the floor for any questions, and I shall stop sharing my screen. And I shall put my video back on.